Okay students, so this is the fourth in our series of independent learning videos for terminology for A-level English language, year 1. So you've already done word class, you've already done lexicon semantics, you've already done the basics of grammar. This is a little bit more work that's advanced grammar. So the basics of grammar was knowing your sentence types and your sentence functions. You have to know your word classes back to front in order to be able to do grammar at all. And obviously some knowledge of lexicon semantics helps, but for this you have to know your sentence types and functions before we get on to doing the advanced grammar. If you're still not happy with that, you should have done a retest anyway, but you need to keep on going back to those previous videos on word class and on basic grammar. And today we're going to push forward, thinking not just about clauses, sentence types, sentence functions, but also thinking about phrases and what we call syntax and word order, things along those lines in sentences. Excuse me, I'm just going to have a quick sip of coffee there before we go on. So the first idea that we're going to deal with is the idea of what we call the phrase. Bigger than a word, smaller than a clause. So it's a group of words. You pick them out. Any sentence will have a number of phrases in. It's not like a sentence where it's definite. You're just picking out a group of words with a distinct what we call head word. Okay? So we can build them up and you can write them yourselves. So if I was to put the noun, I'll use a different pen here. If I was to put the noun pen here, and the noun pen, okay, that's a word, it's a concrete noun. Could be a verb, I'm going to pen a letter, but here it's a concrete noun. And a phrase would be, it's not a clause, but it's bigger than a word, so we need to add in some more words, and so we're going to add in some modifiers to build up a phrase. So I'd very easily just say a black pen, okay, a black pen, okay, a black pen in my hand. So that's a phrase. It's not a sentence. I mean, it could be a minor sentence, but it's not a grammatically correct sentence. It's not a clause. It doesn't have a verb. It does have this subject here, which is the black pen. It's a phrase. It's a group of nouns, a group of words, I beg your pardon, with a distinct head word. And here the head word is pen. The head word, the most important word, is a noun, and so this is a noun phrase, what we call a noun phrase, because all the words are operating on this word here. This is the one you can't do without. A black pen in my hand, okay? You could have a series of 50 adjectives. You could have more prepositional phrases at the end. You could do loads of things with it, but essentially, if it's not a clause, if it's smaller than a clause in terms of not having a subject and a verb, if it's a phrase and it's got a distinct head word, it's defined by that head word. So this is what we call a noun phrase, and you can practice writing them. Okay, so if I was to say, for example, the lovely, bittersweet coffee. Okay, the lovely bittersweet coffee. It's not a clause. Couldn't be. It's not a part of a sentence in the sense of it being a clause. It's not got a verb. It's got this wonderful sort of hyphenated word here, bittersweet. How am I doing? Bittersweet word here, lovely bittersweet coffee, which I am drinking right now. We can see the head word that you should be able to see. There's a word we cannot do without, and it's this word coffee. That's the one that the other ones are acting on. They're all acting on that word there. They're all modifying it there. Lovely as an adjective because it's modifying a noun. Bittersweet, this hyphenated adjective that's modifying this noun here. So that's what we call a noun phrase. Okay? And you can do it with other words as well. So it doesn't have to be a noun phrase. You can have adverbial phrases. You can have prepositional phrases. You can have adjective phrases even, yeah, so it depends on what the head word is and you're the one picking it out. So say for example, if I wanted to use a modifier such as, I don't know, something like tasty. So an evaluative adjective like tasty. It's a sort of very tasty cup of coffee. If that's what the word that I want to build a phrase around, I could have even something like very tasty, very tasty. That's no longer a word, it's a phrase. Okay, very tasty, and I could have very tasty and delicious. Okay, so very tasty on its own could be a phrase, yeah. Very tasty and delicious on its own could be a phrase, and they'd both be what we call adjective phrases because the head word is an adjective. Okay, tasty and delicious. We've got two head words here. It needs both of them, but they're both adjectives, so it's an adjective phrase. Very tasty. The very is modifying the word tasty. The adverb very is modifying the adjective tasty, and so that is an adjective phrase as well. Okay. So let's have a look at the booklet then. We're on page 9 of the booklet. Okay. The first thing you're going to look at is noun phrases. So if you just read through, the most important thing to think about for this test that's coming up is the difference between pre and post modified noun phrases. So all we mean by that is are the words modifying the noun coming before or after the head word. So if I have a look at the suspicious individual, that's a noun phrase. The head word is a noun, an individual, yeah. The suspicious is modifying that word there. And then we could have a post-modifying noun phrase here. We've still got an individual, the individual, yeah, okay. But the modifying phrase here is after it, so it's post-modified noun phrase. The open door, yeah, okay. The open door, the open is modifying that word door, okay. But something like people, old and young is post-modifying. These adjectives come after the head word, the noun. A strangely unsettling but familiar feeling, strangely unsettling but familiar, those words are modifying the word feeling. Now feeling can be a verb, but it's not here because it's a feeling. Can put a determiner in front of it, so it's a noun, a feeling, and those words are modifying the word feeling. But the film, starring the famous actor, that modifying phrase comes after the head word, which is the film. So that noun, film, and then again, could be a verb. Here it's not. The film, a film, yeah, starring that famous actor, is coming after it, so it's post-modification. The other one to do is if you know your different types of determiner, so you should know from the word class study that you've done the difference between definite and indefinite article. So you could have a definite noun phrase with thus, and indefinite noun phrases with a. Okay, so that just means you use a definite article or use the indefinite article. Okay, and then of course you could talk about the modifiers in that noun phrase. So for example, if there's what you should know that there's different types of adjective, you could have evaluative adjectives or defining adjectives. If you go back to the word class video and look again in your word class booklet, in the terminology booklet in previous pages, that's where we use evaluative modifiers, which are subjective, or defining modifiers, which are about the property of the noun, or a more objective or detailed or information sort of focus on those. Okay, so from phrases then, you need to know the head word, you need to know pre and post modification, you need to know definite and indefinite articles, and evaluative and defining modifiers and how they're working on noun phrases. Onto the separate issue, which is the active and the passive voice. And it sounds quite complicated. It's an issue within grammar, which is to do with, I couldn't say it any better than what it says in the booklet, really. In active voice, the subject does the verb, and in passive voice, the subject has the verb done to it. The subject has the verb done to it. Okay, so in the active voice, the subject is the thing doing the verb, and in the passive voice, the subject is the thing that's having the verb done to it. So if we look at we made mistakes, it's the best example. That's the subject, is we, collective first person pronoun we. Made is the verb, okay, so that's a main clause, isn't it? An independent clause. It could be a simple sentence. We made mistakes. Put it in the passive voice, you're putting the object in the subject position, and we're changing that verb around and making it were made. Mistakes were made, okay? Thieves steal the scream is stolen or was stolen. So essentially, one of the things you're doing with the passive voice is you're taking away responsibility for doing something. So you might even find in your own language you do this when you want to say it's less of your responsibility. So rather than saying, I didn't do my homework, you could say, my homework was not done. Okay? So that's a way of taking away responsibility. Okay? Okay, so the next part of this then is looking at other elements of grammar would be the structures within grammar, structures within sentences, and so there's a number of different terms here. I'm not going to do everything in lots and lots of detail, but you do need to look through the booklet and think about other examples. Perhaps in your glossary, get some other examples that you understand yourself or other ways of describing them. But the most important point about all of these is that they are about how a sentence has been structured. So ellipsis would be where you're sort of missing something out. In the structure of a sentence, you've missed out certain words. Triples or rule of three, you should know from GCSE, where you've got three things, or quadratic four things in its structure. Parenthesis is another way of talking about brackets. Okay. Fronting and ad focus is about where you're putting a word. So a fronted conjunction would be an and or a but at the start of a sentence, or changing which bit you're putting at the beginning of the sentence. Jobs, that's what we want. We've put the plural noun jobs at the front there. Quoted speeches, quotations. Anaphoric and cataphoric references. The man lay down, he was tired. So we've got anaphoric references is where we refer back to a noun that was previously stated, and cataphoric is where we sort of refer to something we haven't said yet. So he lay down, the man was tired. Syntax is all about word order. So parallel syntax might be we're having a parallel structure of the word order. Live by the sword, die by the sword. You can see that we repeated the word over there, or we could sort of like flip it over or have a parallel or mirrored structure. Archaic syntax would be like word order in the olden days, thou shalt not pass. Conditional sentences are sentences where we have a subordinated conjunction starting with if. If he starts singing, I am going to leave, or I'm leaving. Complex sentences with a conditional subordinate clause. And then existential sentences, sounds quite philosophical, doesn't it, is you start a sentence with there and stating that something exists. So there are nuts on the table, there is a God, or even there isn't a God. These would be existential statements about what exists. So for each of those, I recommend that you come up with other examples and put them in your glossary. Okay. And the final thing that we're going to look at for the advanced grammar is this idea of modal auxiliary verbs. So we're going to look at lots and lots of different types of auxiliary in the future weeks. However, what we're looking at here is modal auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary means sort of helping, sort of like assisting verbs or sort of secondary verbs. And modal is a type of word that expresses like possibility or duty. You always get them next to or part of another verb. And essentially it's just a list. It's easiest to remember them just by the types of words they are. So can, could, may, might, will, would, shall, should, and must. They're verbs, but you can't really use them on their own. You'd have to use it alongside something else. So I couldn't say, it would be slightly strange. So I can write well. I can write well. That can and the write are going to have to work together. I write well is one meaning, but I can write sort of a flavour of meaning of the type of activity you can do. So they're sort of never really found on their own, unless it's sort of an elliptical sentence or a minor sentence, and they adjust the meaning of the verb, but they're not adverbs. They're a sort of a helping verb in that way. Okay, so can expresses ability, but it can also express in interrogatives, can express permission or possibility. So it's possible. So I can swim, special ability. Can I go is asking for permission, and possibility is expressed by it can, it could. That type of idea. It can cause cancer. Ability in the past, I could swim. Okay. Polite permission, could I try, when it's an interrogative, or possibility, it could rain. So these ones are expressing possibility. Some of them are all about permission, so may, and in this sort of standard English, old-fashioned English almost version, may I borrow that, or may I please go, is actually the standard form, whereas most people use the sort of more modern form, which is can I go, can I borrow a pen? Sort of really old-fashioned teachers might go, oh, may I borrow a pen? Because that's more sort of standard English, a bit more old-fashioned as well. But it's technically expressing permission or possibility, so especially if it's in the future, so it may happen. Again, might, sort of polite permission, might I please go, and possibility again. Will is always about certainty, it will happen, or willingness, if it's an interrogative, will you try? Would is often used sort of in conditional sentences, so I would do it if, for example, or willingness in an interrogative would be would you do it, or are you willing to do it? Shall is quite an old, you shall go to the ball, Cinderella, is quite an old-fashioned one, but we still use it. It expresses certainty in a sort of almost archaic form, it shall rain, or obligation in a very sort of formal and archaic type of way, you shall do your job. Should is about advice, okay, so you're giving advice, so in advice text you might get that, or sort of weak obligation, I should go, but it's usually followed by but. Or it could be a logical conclusion. Well, it should work now, shouldn't it? And then must is about strong obligation, you must do it. Or a logical conclusion, well, he must be tired by now. So you need to learn this list. I would definitely recommend learning at least 5 or 6 of these. When I say modal verb, what comes to mind? And then thinking about in more detail, what do they express? So one that expresses possibility. And for the test, you will need to know not only what the modal verb is, but what it expresses. So I might ask you, give me a modal verb that expresses permission. Yeah. So there's several possibilities, but expect you to be able to tell me a modal verb that expresses permission. So in summary, then we've looked at phrases, so noun and adjective phrases, pre and post modification. We've looked at, what was the other thing we were looking at? Oh yes, active and passive voice. So I'm going to be asking you to change active to passive voice and vice versa. We've looked at different types of structures within sentences. So there's nothing other than just sort of putting these in your glossary with different examples. And then we've looked at modal auxiliary verbs, helping verbs that express possibility or duty. Now, if you wanted to push a bit further, you might want to do some research on what we call deontic and epistemic modal auxiliaries. So if you wanted to get a head start on those, but I won't be testing you on that quite yet. But we do need to get there in future, so it's not a bad idea. So different types, deontic and epistemic. But for the time being, if you just have a good, nice list of modal verbs and also an understanding of what they do, so the expressibility in the past or the express possibility, etc. Okay, so that concludes advanced grammar.